Here we go! Welcome to the Nintendo Power Zone. We are a videocast/podcast dedicated to bringing you the best Nintendo-related topics. As always, I'm your host, Nice One, and we are joined by my co-host, Blues, and a very special guest. We have the author of Console Wars, Sega, Nintendo, and the Battle That Defined a Generation, but he's also the author of The History of the Future, Oculus, Facebook, and the Revolution That Swept Virtual Reality. He is also the director of the upcoming Console Wars documentary, at least one of them. We have Blake J. Harris. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me back on. It has been several years, and I'm glad that you're still rocking it, still spreading the gospel of Nintendo and retro gaming, and thanks for having me back.
Oh, it is our absolute pleasure to have you back on this show. But before we jump into the interview, we have a bunch of congratulations I just want to toss your way. So first off, you announced the expanded edition of your second book, The History of the Future. You have announced the release date. That you've announced your streaming partner for the documentary, CBS All Access, and the documentary will be premiering at South by Southwest this year. So congratulations on all those fronts. That is all huge news.
Yeah, thank you. It's really nice. I basically feel like I've spent my past 8 years just working on two projects, one about Sega, Nintendo, one about Oculus. And that's how I like it. I love diving deep into these things. And clearly, even when I'm done, quote unquote, there's still so much more of the story I want to tell. So with the expanded edition of the paperback, that's going to have 70 more pages, like I finally feel like I can get the rest out there. And then similar with the documentary, like it's so nice to actually be able to have a visual component and have the firsthand interviews and get that out there too. And I love both stories. So I'm really excited that they're going to be coming out.
What's cool about the documentary is it's kind of always been kind of hand in hand with the book. So, obviously the book came out much sooner, but we're getting so close. I can't wait for that South by Southwest premiere. And I have to say, I'm a little angry at you because I have now had to get myself into another streaming service. So I've now got the gamut: Netflix, Hulu, CBS All Access, Disney Plus, ESPN Plus. You got me all. I'm about to just cancel my cable.
I know it's kind of annoying, but here's the good news: that's the whole point of why CBS wanted to make this show, because they want to, get new subscribers, and then because of people like you, they'll be able to make other cool content like this, or whether it's other video game content, and I'll be able to make more stuff. So I know it's annoying entering this streaming era, but CBS has been an awesome partner to us, and the Picard show I highly recommend you check out too. They've got a bunch of good stuff.
I'm gonna wait for a few episodes. I really like to binge because I'm used to that Netflix format now. They've indoctrinated me to the point where I need the whole season at once.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive into this interview proper. I want to start with Console Wars because there's so much on the horizon when it comes to that project, because it's not just a book anymore, and we're coming up on that book's 6th-year anniversary. And I'm not going to lie, I've read it about 10 times at this point. It never ceases to amaze me how much I enjoy the book and how engaging it still is. But now that you're moving into the TV space, what changes in terms of engagement? Like, what do you see? How does the interaction from just, the reading switch when we're going to be watching? How do you capture our imagination the same way?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question, because essentially that's what I've been asking myself for the past 2 years. And I'm co-directing the documentary with my friend and collaborator Jonah Tulis, and that's like what we're always trying to ask ourselves. Like, the book is a 550-page quick read though story, and then how do you condense it to 80 to 100-minute version of events? What can you do in a documentary that you can't do in a book? What should you be doing? These were all the questions that we asked each other and the rest of the team over the past couple of years. And so one of the most fun things, and I especially think for people our age, even college age students, it basically, with the book, I always say that everything I write with my grandmother in mind. Like, how can I get my grandma to care about Sega, Tom Kalinske, Sonic the Hedgehog? And to do so, it's not to rely on nostalgia. It's not to rely on old commercials, because my grandma probably doesn't remember them. I could try to describe them, but you don't get that visceral feeling. And so the most fun thing has been, we think of the documentary as a time capsule. So getting in all the pop culture elements of the era, getting in the actual trade show footage, getting in what it felt like to go through that has been the most fun thing and one of the biggest differentiators. And so, even if you were not alive during the Welcome to the Next Level campaign of commercials, the ones that ended with the Sega scream, the Sega, you'll still at least get it in a way that, it's talked about in the book, but I also didn't rely too much on trying to get people to feel an emotional connection to that, because I just think it was not possible. And then also just like the best part is the having it not be in my own words. I think that what made the book work so well was that I was able to capture people's voices, but now you'll actually get to see. I was so lucky with Console Wars. It was not only like a great story of like a significant battle that meant a lot to a lot of people, and that we all have memories of, but it was just the characters were so incredible. And there have been some critics of the book, and they say, people don't really talk like that sometimes, but they do, and now people will get to see them. And Tom Kalinske is a way more interesting speaker than I am, so being able to have him tell the story, or Al Milstein, or Ellen Beth Van Buskirk, or Peter Main, or Howard Lincoln, or any of these people, like, it's just so cool to have them all there in one place, because these people were pioneers. They what they did created the game industry as we know it today. And like the best rivalries that, Sega and Nintendo pushed each other to new heights that helped us in the end, as gamers and as fans.
I can actually attest. We had Tom Kalinske on this show a month after we had you that first time. Tom has a pair on him. I'm not gonna he is the most bold but cool person you ever meet. Like, if I could have a drink with one semi-celebrity and just be completely at ease with that person, it would be Tom. He's brash, but he's not in a impolite way. He's just a cool dude. So yeah,
totally agree. Like, one of the hardest parts coming off of Console Wars, aside from like the nostalgia and the emotional resonance that a lot of people have to Sega and Nintendo, was like trying to find a subject or subjects that was worthy of my time, or maybe that's not the way to put it, but like that I was interested enough to write about, because Tom was such a cool guy, such a great role model, a person who, I didn't realize it at the time, had such an impact on my childhood behind the scenes. And so it was hard to find another story with characters that were worth following. And Tom really is everything you said. I've talked to him, at least once a week for the past 5 years now, and he's still the person that I'd pick to like have dinner with, because there's no shortage of stories there, and he's a great storyteller.
Not only that, but I am a terrible person when it comes to names. Tom remembers your name. He speaks to you once. Yeah. He remembers your name. I spoke to him again, just personally, about 3 years after. He remembered me. Remember the interview? That guy is on some next level genius shit, and it's no wonder how he was able to do what he did with Sega and the team that he built. Let's go ahead and move on. What are the biggest challenges of turning a book like Console Wars into a documentary?
The biggest challenge for me has just been the scope of the story. The book is 500 plus pages, and to be honest, it could have been twice that length. Like, there's no shortage. You could do like a whole page on the making of every interesting game, but I tried to keep the book, have a central narrative and to keep it moving. And then for the doc to try to do it in like, the final film is going to be like between 85 and 90 minutes. So basically trying to figure out what not to include and who not to include also. It's really tough because I know the full story. So, if we're going to do the creation of Sonic in 5 minutes and the book spends 50 pages on it, and then on it, because there's so many people that are involved, that has been the hardest part. But, I think it's a good skill, and I have to say it's very helpful and nice for me too to know that the book exists, so that you are inherently going to be sort of like just giving like the short version of everything. So at least knowing if you wanted to read more about Mortal Kombat or the Senate hearings, there's the text is out there. But that's been the hardest part.
Awesome. So, key differences between the documentary, like what's the fact gathering like? Was it part of the book writing process, or did you have to basically start from scratch when working on the documentary? And also, was there anybody who was willing to talk about that was willing to appear in the book but not in the documentary?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is sort of a unique situation. I mean, in a lot of ways, because we are fortunate to have a TV series based on a doc based on the book or based on the same story. But it was unique too that I wrote the book in 2013. It came out in 2014, like you said, almost 6 years ago. And we actually filmed almost all the main interviews back in 2013. So I had the information. I had done the interviews while I was writing the book. So it wasn't like stuff came out after that I wish that I had put in there, though obviously there are different stories in each. But I remember being very stressed at the time that we were filming stuff while I was supposed to be writing the book, because it was my first book. I didn't know if I'd be able to finish it. But it turned out to be for the best, because I was also spending more time with these people. And so the fact gathering was like, I work very, perhaps unsurprisingly, like I need to see things in writing. So for me, having a transcript of the interview or transcribing my own interviews is like what I need to help see the story. So after we did transcripts of all the interviews, and this was after the book came out, just going through that was like the best way to figure out where to sort of find the original pieces. And then, of course, a big difference with the doc and the book is it's not just if the information is interesting, it's like how the person delivers it, how they tell the story is important, or at least part of what you want to weigh. And so just watching through those interviews several times. But yeah, like that was pretty much the process. And then also seeing what you have, as with any storytelling, any nonfiction storytelling, a part of the process is what can you get? What do you have access to? I was never able to interview Mr. Arakawa, the president of Nintendo of America, and I tried to honor him in the book, but I think it's kind of obvious that there was his perspective was lacking, and I didn't try to hide that. But you have to work with what you have. Fortunately, I believe everyone who we wanted to be in the documentary agreed to be in it. Maybe it took a little while to make that happen, but we were at least able to get everyone. And then in terms of like the archival material, there are certain events that there's not video records of, or it would be hard to sort of show in a way that would be compelling. So maybe that's not as much, as big of a beat in the movie, in the documentary, or maybe something that we would try to animate. So just trying to weigh all those things. But I always like to look at it from like the perspective of like a chef. Like I want to have the ingredients first, see what I have, and then start mixing things together so that I can try to make the best with the ingredients that I have.
Awesome. All right. So not really console wars related, but I'm going to lump it in there. You in November you started putting out content rated by an oral history on the ESRB. Discusses a lot of things about the formation and the role it plays in gaming society back then and now. What led you to this project? Because this is really a different beat from what you've been doing over the last few years.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought it up, because I would really encourage people to read it. It's I think it's like 20,000 word oral history of the ESRB, the organization that rates the games, and how that all started. And I guess part of it is like, actually, some of it is very related. Like the origins of the ESRB go back to the Senate subcommittee hearings from 1993 with Mortal Kombat and Night Trap and the stuff that's mentioned in the book. And like kind of getting back to what I said at the top of the show about like, doing the expanded edition, doing the documentary, it's like these are two stories, Oculus story and the Sega Nintendo story, that mean so much to me that I'm sure, the reason I do them is because I'm personally very curious. So if there's like a sort of related angle to explore, I'm usually pretty interested to do so. So the ESRB had contacted me. They were, for their 25th anniversary, they were thinking about doing some sort of article or something. It ended up becoming much bigger than what we had originally envisioned, because the story was very fascinating. And so once they reached out to me, I was pretty quick to agree to want to learn more. And there's even things a lot of things I didn't know, even about this, like the Senate hearings from 1993. I did like the Video Game Violence Act or whatever it was, the almost the censoring of the video game industry. And so I found it fascinating too, because I'm also someone who really is very, very pro free speech. Like big proponent of the First Amendment. And people look at organizations like the ESRB or the MPAA, the Movie Ratings Agency, and think like, oh, these are anti-free speech. But one way to look at it, and the way that I would look at it, is that because of them, we are able to, it's a self-governing organization. So it's basically just creating like community standards. And so you can still do whatever you want, but as a parent, you want to, have the shorthand of knowing what your child is going to be using. And I think that's good. I think as long as it's not, actually there was a Supreme Court ruling that basically, because of the great enforcement by the ESRB, video games are protected as a First Amendment piece of work. So I found all that side of it very interesting too.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good read. It kind of came out of nowhere. Was not expecting like this, because typically, I'm not gonna say I've kind of followed your Twitter religiously to see what new is happening over there. Like, oh, we're getting a new book or news on the project.
Yeah.
And then I saw the this, and I was like, this is awesome. And kind of, if you were to do an expanded edition of Console Wars, you could throw out like 90% of what's in here into that, and it would fit in properly.
Maybe we could. Yeah, that was originally, the project was like they kind of just wanted something for their 25th anniversary. Like I don't even think it was really supposed to be public facing that much. It was more just because I always thought, hey, if they're going to give me the access, and this is a good excuse for me to tell it. But then working with them was great, because most of the time when you work with someone, an editor or whatever, a publication, they're pretty adamant about like word counts or sort of like parameters that are arbitrary. But like working with the ESRB people, as I found more stuff, and as we they were thinking more stuff, like we very organically expanded what it was, and they were super encouraging, which was an unusual experience for me. So I really enjoyed that process. And it gave me a good excuse to interview Tom Kalinske again, and Howard Lincoln, and Don James from Nintendo, and all these people that were sporadically in Console Wars and were involved in the formation of this organization.
Awesome. So right now, the ESRB is actually under pretty heavy scrutiny over, things like loot boxes and microtransactions. So I've kind of find the article the timing of it, I thought it was a little poignant, because it's like, now that I know that they had asked you to do it, I wonder how much of it. I don't want to say that they're deflecting, but it seems like they're deflecting, especially under like this intense scrutiny. Do you know if did it seem like any kind of like malice when they called you up and said, "Hey, do something for us"?
Okay, so like obviously that's outside. Like I don't know what their motivations are, and I can't really speak to that. All I can say is that like in the entire time of the people I dealt with there, no one ever even like subtly said like, "Oh, this will help," get people focused on other things. Like at least when I was speaking with them, they're always very sincere, and I think that most organizations, even your podcast, like there's a mythology to your own founding and to like what you stand for. So I think that they did genuinely like it. I also think like they from my perspective, it's not. I don't feel like they've gone crazy out of their way to promote this oral history series. They did partner with VentureBeat and put the stuff up there, but like, I don't know. It's not like they're taking out ads. I don't feel like they're trying to distract from something. But that's pure speculation on my part. And I'll also say like, obviously, like loot boxes. These are things that have been in the ether of a conversation for a while, but it wasn't like I started working on that like a year ago, so it couldn't have been something that we started to like try to deflect something over the past few months. But
I hate to ask the question. It just I have to ask it.
Yeah, no, it's totally fair question, and like I think it's also, you learn a lot about how the organization works, the good and the bad, and that is relevant to dealing with loot boxes. That's also relevant to like at one point when I was working on this, there was like a tragic, shooting, and President Trump and other people in Congress were talking about video games being bad again. It was like history repeating itself. And so I think that, there's a lot in that story that just shows you about how, government works and how self-regulation works, and just a lot of these things coming up over and over again. And so I think there's lessons to be learned, and I was happy to participate in it. Whether it helped deflect attention or not, it's kind of irrelevant to me, though I understand why you'd care and why. I mean, seems like a fair suspicion, but like from my perspective, they were awesome to work with, and I'm just glad they gave me an excuse to tell more of that story.
Do you actually have an opinion on their stance on loot boxes and microtransactions in video games?
No, I actually don't. I mean, like I'm not very well informed. But why don't you tell me a little bit about the situation?
Basically, they what they said is like. So the whole argument is that any game that contains microtransactions and loot boxes should have a higher age rating. We're getting to the point now where some publishers are actually not submitting the microtransactions when they send the games out for review, and then they add the DLC through DLC. They add it, and the ESRB's stance on it is like it doesn't fundamentally change the content of the game, but people are arguing that loot boxes, microtransactions are essentially gambling, and gambling, any games that simulate gambling should have at least an M rating. And they're, that
sounds like familiar enough. Like, I guess I'm familiar with that stuff. So, I guess it's not just like pro free speech. I'm generally pretty, I guess libertarian with that sort of stuff. So like, thinking that gambling should be legalized and all that, but at the same time, like I said, like the purpose of the ESRB is to just, what I like about it is that it's an assessment. It's a tool. Like, so a parent could say, okay, this is a PG-13 movie. This is a G game. It doesn't mean that like if a parent wants a kid to see an R-rated movie, they can go see it with them. So I think that's like kind of fair. If I was a parent, I would prefer to not have my kid be in a situation where they feel like they need to spend money or need to gamble. Like it's less about the gambling thing to me than the iterative aspect of it and spending money. I definitely don't agree that anytime something blank should be mature. Like, I don't know that there should be like such a strict parameter, but that's also like, I'm glad that it's not my job. I'm glad I'm not making those decisions because as we know, like 99.9, everything in life is like a gray area. So coming up with harsh parameters to say this is M, this is not M, like that seems pretty tough. And that's why I'm glad it's not me, but it's so tough. Like, there's a million changes to the game industry and the game since 1993, 94, but like, the most obvious one that makes their job very interesting, difficult, is just that back in 93, 94, you submitted a complete game and that was it. Maybe you'd have an expansion pack. Maybe you'd release a sequel. But like now, like you were saying, like you could submit a build and then a week later have a different build, or you can, based on game, the player feedback, you could change it. And sometimes you would be, doing it as like a sneaky workaround, or maybe sometimes you actually think, wow, this is a mechanic, or this is what we need to make the game better, and it's hard to assess the integrity of intentions like that. So it just makes for a really difficult time.
Oh, see, like hitting a home run.
I guess the one thing I would say is like I think that if you have loot boxes or gambling or whatever you want to call it, I think it should at least be listed. It doesn't mean that it should be prohibited or whatever, but like I think that's a feature in a game that should be listed, just like cartoon violence is listed.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of neutral on the position. I don't necessarily view it as gambling, but I can see the arguments for it. But let's go back to the documentary just a bit before we move on to the history of the future. I know this is always, I call Console Wars a project because it's more than just the book and that's documentary, but there was also a theatrical film in the works. Is that still happening, or has that shifted into a different project within the Console Wars project as a whole?
Yeah, great question. It originally, we sold the film rights to the book to Sony to be a feature film, like sort of like we were saying back then, like Social Network, but with video games, and Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg and Scott Rudin were involved producing it. And all those same people, Scott, Seth, and Evan, are producing the documentary, and they're also producing what the feature film project has now become, which is a televised television series, and that's also going to be with CBS All Access. So, CBS, in my opinion, did like a very I'm glad that they embraced the Console Wars project universe, like you have. Like, I could imagine a scenario where they're like, oh, we're already doing a TV series, we don't need a documentary, or vice versa. But that was never how I saw it. I saw it as they all make they're all great in their own way, and they all enhance the whole understanding for people who are interested in it. And so, yeah, so we're not doing a feature film anymore. It is going to be a TV series. I'm sure it wouldn't shock you to know that I'm happy about that. As someone who writes very long things, I would prefer not to condense the story to 90 minutes and to actually have a season or 2 seasons or whatever it is to tell the full story. So I'm pretty psyched about that.
See, I think this is better for the book as a whole, because a lot of the shows that I've started to enjoy lately in my 30s are these shows that are geared at this really happened. We're going to tell it over like 6 parts, and we'll either find a streaming partner or we'll broadcast on TV, like the O.J. Simpson trial, American Crime Story. That I lived through that, and that show was still engaging me. It was like I was 6 years old all over again watching that stuff on the news, but they did such a good job with the casting, and it was so well acted. I was like, this is the kind of stuff I like now in my 30s. I love shit like this. So I feel
you're
like
totally
this
right.
Better for Console Wars.
And the OG thing is a great example too, because the series on FX was awesome. Cuba Gooding Jr. is great, and David Schwimmer and all that stuff. And then also around the same time, you had that ESPN documentary that was like the 5-part, several-hour OJ documentary. And again, like someone could say, oh, well, you're going to see one or the other, or they would cannibalize each other. But no, they actually, one helped the other create more interest, and they both were unique in their own way, and both were great, in my opinion. And so, in my perfect world, I would get to be a part of both. So it's nice that it's worked out that way. I remember when I was in high school, I used to read fiction, and my friend said, oh, everyone reads fiction now, but when you grow up, you only read nonfiction. I was like, I'm never going to read nonfiction. I don't care about real life stuff. And now, like you said, like that's all I care. That's all I like to read is like what really happened behind the scenes with this thing that I kind of remember. And so those are the stories that I like to read. Those are the stories I like to watch. And so those are unsurprisingly the stories I like to tell.
And you know what they say, like reality is stranger than fiction a lot of the time. So it's always cool to see.
I'm sure we'll get into it with the history of the future, because there's definitely a lot of stranger than fiction stuff in that. But like, actually, that's the whole thing. It's like if I there's a good example of history of the future that we can get to, but like even with the end of Console Wars, spoiler alert, but like Tom Kalinske tries to partner with Sony and tries to partner with Silicon Graphics, and it doesn't work out for reasons you can look into, but Silicon Graphics ends up working with Nintendo to create N64, and Sony ends up creating the PlayStation. And so like they ended up passing up on the 2 consoles that were their demise. I'm like, that's so poetic. That's so like only in real life could you get away with telling that story like that. Otherwise it would be like, oh, too obvious, too on the nose. But that's really how it went down.
All right. So last couple of questions about Console Wars, and then I really want to dive into the history of the future. But CBS All Access, how did that happen? Like, how do you get this deal? Because do they pursue you? Or is this you guys were you just still shopping things around?
So that I am an executive producer on the TV series, and I always view my role as like sort of the ambassador to the real life people and to the story. Like, I want to make sure that I know the real people. I want to make sure that they're portrayed as accurately as possible. I mean, obviously it's a dramatization, but like I know these people. I want to make sure they're protected, and so, but I guess the point is that like I'm not the chief driving creative force for that. That was and is Jordan Voight-Roberts, the director, and Mike Rosolio, the writer, and working with Seth and Evan and Point Grey. And so that was really like, there's a lot, they're the ones driving that. And there's a lot of interest to work with those people, especially with Seth and Evan and everything that Point Grey has done. So, I believe at some point they had a pitch ready to go, and they set up a lot of meetings, and then they kept us in the loop to let us know how things were going. And then at some point they said, well, here are the places that are interested. You should go pitch the documentary to them. And then I went out, and Jonah and I, presented, like a little sizzle reel for the documentary. And that was how it went.
Awesome. All right. So how they've been as a partner?
They've been awesome. I gave a lot of credit to the ESRB for being a good partner, and CBS All Access deserves that too. You never know when you're getting into bed with someone. All you really have to go off of is like what they've done in the past, but you don't know what it would be like to work with them. And for a company like CBS All Access that is still finding its footing, it's a relatively new streaming service, and they're competing against the likes of Disney Plus and Peacock and all these things that you mentioned. And so I didn't know what to expect, but so far it's been awesome. And the fact that they were willing to do the series and also a documentary is like, that warms my heart. So I couldn't be happier with that.
Well, literally, once you guys announced the streaming partner, I was already like, well, here we go. I was like, let's go ahead and let's see where we can get this extra money from. What can we cut? Came out of YouTube.
Thank you.
It came out of the YouTube fund.
Thank you. That means a lot. That's like that really is awesome.
All right.
I am a co-director with Jonah on the documentary, so that's the one that's really like I have very the control of the vision, so I can promise you're not going to be disappointed. And I feel very confident in saying the same about the TV series, though. We'll have to see how that goes. But so far, the pilot script's awesome and everything's going great. So I think you won't regret the allocation of funds to CBS.
All right, awesome. All right, so now the history of the future. I really can't wait to talk about this book. So I'm on my third read of this book, and I have to say, the book has definitely got a vibe of like a pseudo sequel to The Accidental Billionaires. Was that intentional?
I mean, The Accidental Billionaires, just and so for viewers and listeners who don't know, it's like that was the book by Ben Mesrick that became The Social Network. It's definitely one of my favorite books. I'm looking at it, it's right over there. It was not necessarily intentional, but I've said in the past, and it's very true, that Ben Mesrick is probably the biggest or one of the biggest influences on my writing style, on my approach to storytelling, and so like I guess it's not surprising that the combination of my being very inspired and being a big fan of Ben's work, and then the fact that I did see that I definitely saw this as like a sequel to The Social Network in the sense that it's a story that for the first, I mean, the whole thing is about Oculus, but after they get acquired by Facebook in 2014 for $3 billion. And then the second half of the book is sort of a view of Facebook 10 years beyond The Accidental Billionaires, of like how Facebook's changed sort of through the lens of Oculus. And so I did really see it as a sequel in that regard. I think it will make a good sequel-ish thing to The Social Network. And I also think it's like, it really does show you how much Facebook has changed. As anyone somewhat familiar with Oculus or the book would know, Palmer Luckey, the brilliant founder of Oculus, ends up being fired from Facebook for reasons that I'm sure we'll get into. But like, he ultimately his personality is very much like Mark Zuckerberg's was back in 2004. Hacker, tinkerer, sort of little bit of a pushing the envelope sort of a guy. And it's just interesting to see that now, 10 years later, Facebook has no place for someone like that because the company has changed so much.
All right, so that leads me to my next question. Why Oculus? Your last book delves into subject matter, for the most part, a lot of the consumers of video games wouldn't have been privy to due to the fact that information wasn't as readily available. We didn't have the internet,
sure,
and we didn't have all these like in-depth documentaries, and we didn't have authors like you standing beside these people while they were working on the content. And another thing is that from a consumer standpoint, the Oculus story is one that we lived through. We got like semi-regular updates onto the building process up to its release, the Kickstarter, and even after the fact, what happened to Palmer. Like we lived through this. We were privy to it. We didn't have the same experience Palmer had. But
sure,
this is a story that the information isn't as difficult to obtain as I would say as some of the stuff that you had to delve into for Console Wars. So why Oculus?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said, and that made it a lot harder for me. But so I guess to take you back into my mindset, like I said earlier, it was very hard for me to find another topic that I was interested in. So for me, it's like the way I write a book, I know that I'm going to spend 2, 3, 4 years on it. I'm going to be waking up every day working on this thing because it becomes my life. So it's really hard to find a topic that I'm interested in, and largely because of the people. There were some other stories I found interesting, but I didn't really like talking to people as much. And so like I was immediately charmed by Palmer and Brendan Arieb, and Nate Mitchell and Mike, the other co-founders. John Carmack was obviously, he played a key role early on and then later joined the company. And then also in terms of like why I bit so big in that story that was still unfolding and that people, wasn't as uncovered video game history like stuff from the 80s and 90s, was because, to me, Sega and Nintendo, the subtitle of the book is that it's this, Sega, the battle that defined a generation. And I did genuinely believe that like what would define this period of time for video games would be VR. I was obviously wrong about that, or at least I'm wrong to date. So part of my belief was like, I just put on the headset for the first time and I was so blown away, like a lot of people, and felt like this is the future. I want to, write about this as it's happening. And like I said, that did not, VR is not nearly as successful as the people in the story thought, as I would have expected. I mean, I think I always believed it was going to be a slow build, and it kind of has been. But still, you would have, I would have thought it would be happening faster, and more so. Like I would have thought that the team would still be there. I didn't think that by the time the book came out, almost everyone from the company would be gone. And then and part of it too was like the challenge of seeing if I could write a story as it was unfolding. Like, when I went to sell or pitch Console Wars, I said, here, from the very first day after doing my research, I said, here's the beginning, here's the middle, here's the end, here's like a chapter outline. With this book, I had no idea what it was going to become. I didn't know where it would end. That was scary, but that was also fun. And also, it was really interesting to be speaking to these people as it was happening. Like I wish that I could have been in touch with Tom Clancy as the Console War story is happening. And you also learn a lot more because, when interviewing all the people from Console Wars, they had the benefit of knowing how things turned out. So things that might have seemed like a big deal, they probably didn't remember as much. Things that didn't seem like a big deal didn't remember as much, and things that did, they almost have a preconceived narrative of things. Whereas if I'm interviewing Oculus people and they're dealing with a backlash, or they're planning something and they don't know how it's going to go, like that was really fascinating. I also thought that there was a benefit to sort of what you're saying, like that the information was more readily available. Like there were no emails during the Sega Nintendo battle, or there was by the end of like 94 or so. But this is for this book, I literally went through 25,000 emails and had access to all this information. And so I could, for me, who's just personally curious, I can get go as far down the rabbit hole as much further down the rabbit hole. And so that was really fascinating. And I think that like most stories, even the ones that are in the public sphere and which I don't mean to say like Oculus was misleading, but like there was so much more to it than what was being reported on their Kickstarter page. And again, of course, that's more than most companies do and more than Sega and Nintendo did. But like there was still, I had no idea that like Palmer was living in a trailer at the beginning of the story. I had no idea of like how these guys all came together. And I also, like I said, I write everything with my grandma in mind. So my grandma wasn't really reading the Wired article. She wasn't a Kickstarter backer. And I also it was really important to me. And it was one of the harder things with that book was I wanted to write a book that I thought would still be as good and as relevant 10 years from now, whether or not Oculus was successful or not. But I didn't want it to just be like, here's all the newsworthy things that are in the book. Like I wanted it to be a story like Console Wars that could stand on its own. And then the last thing that was really important to me was because I was and still am a believer in the VR technology and what it could do, is I wanted to help bring the story to people like my grandma, people who would have no interest in VR, but now after reading the book, maybe would be willing to try it, to talk to her grandson, or to, who saw that there's a human face behind this seemingly science fiction technology. So it was part of, I thought that the book could be a bit of like an ambassador to people like that.
Awesome. All right.
If I could interject on that, actually, just to talk about my experience. I'm 21 years old. I was not really alive for most of the Console Wars stuff. And so I feel very, not disconnected, but I don't have as much of a connection as you or Nice One might have. But I was in high school during the events of History of the Future. and I can say, hey, I remember hearing about that Kickstarter. I remember, all the things that happen, to the point where there's a point in the book where I guess it's a text message or an email, but Palmer Luckey is talking with, I forget who, I don't want to think it's Nate Mitchell, about how the McRib is back. The McDonald's McRib is back.
Yeah, Ralph Patel.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And that's something I remember being in high school, like learning about Oculus, but also my friends freaking out. Oh, the McRib is back. Oh my gosh. And so it's something, as I lived through it, I can look back to those exact moments, and that's really cool. And that's something I didn't really get with Console Wars. So wanted to also touch on that here.
Like I really want, part of the reasons that the books are, my 2 books are both like 500 pages, and as opposed to like a Ben Mesrick book, which I obviously love, they're about half that size. It's because it's really important to me to try to get more of the pop culture and more of the expanded aspects of the industry. And so like, I think it would be easier for an editor to say, oh, why do we need this line about the McRib? That doesn't have anything to do with like Oculus. But I really want, for people like you, or, I wanted to have those cultural connections. I want to put it in a time and a place. And so I'm glad that it resonated with you. It's cool.
Hilarious. When I was reading the book, the McRib was actually back in my region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same.
All right. So,
well, I'll tell you, one of my favorite additions, I mean, most of the stuff that I added for the enhanced edition, like the 70 pages of new stuff, it's like very relevant, businessy, Facebooky stuff. But some of it too is just like fun character stuff that maybe my editor wasn't psyched about putting in before. But like the McRib thing, it was like the way that it happens in the book is like Palmer says, guess what, to his friend Narav, and you think that it's going to be like some big tech thing because there's so much big tech stuff going on. And he's like, the McRib is back. And then one of the additions that I was able to add was like a follow-up conversation that they had 2 days later that I always thought was funny, where Narav says to Palmer, he says like, hey, I have some good news or something like that. And Palmer's like, I already know the good news. The McRib is back. And then I was like, no. Well, yeah. But like, there's good news with like our mobile VR headset. And I just like that Palmer was, I already know the good news. The good news is back.
That sounds like Palmer, actually. Straight up.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, this question is a little bit weird, but I got to ask. When I had originally had you on the podcast and you were pretty early in the stages of the book, the second book, it sounded like the book was going to be a little bit more encompassing when it came to other VR companies. And I found this article series you had done. For the life of me, I could not refine it for this interview, where you delved into other companies like The Void. Did the focus on actually shrink?
VR. And I wrote about The Void and a few other companies that were doing like arcade location-based VR.
Yeah,
good memory.
Like 6 different companies, and I kept trying to find it. Like, my iPad broke somewhere in between, and I didn't set it up the same way, and I had it bookmarked on the old iPad. But it was a great read, and you told the story of like between 4 and 6 companies that were all working in either the VR or the AR space, and how it all kind of came together in the end. And I was wondering, did this exit the book, or was this always its separate thing, or did the narrative of the book shrink just to focus on Oculus?
That's an awesome question. I'm glad you remembered that. And because a few other people knew that and have asked me about it. But so, like I said, like I prefer as much as possible to not have an agenda, have a plan. I like to just keep collecting as much ingredients as I can, and then figuring out like what's the best meal to make. And definitely early on, I was thinking that this would be, Oculus would be a big part of the story, but just like one part of the story. And maybe Valve and HTC Vive and would be a bigger part of it, and then maybe companies like The Void. And then the more I thought about it, I was really thinking in terms of like what I said about how can I write a book that 10 years from now people will still want to read, and I was trying to think like, I guess a comp that kept coming to mind was like Mad Men. Like if you were going to tell a story of advertising in the 60s, you have 2 options, or I guess you have a lot of options, but like the 2 obvious ones to me seem, you can tell a story with like, here's 10 different agencies and here's what 10 different companies are up to, or you can just focus on Sterling Cooper and through them try to tell the other story. But obviously you are cutting off those other, it is much more tunnel vision on this. And I felt that was the way to go because the characters were so fascinating, and because what happened to Oculus, because Oculus was driving the VR revolution, and because what happened to them, I think, is pretty indicative of what happened to a lot of other companies. The one caveat, though, to that was if I were to do Console Wars over, one thing I would do would I'd probably want to spend more time with like one of the developers, like id Software with Tarmac would be a good example, or even with Acclaim and with Midway and the creation of Mortal Kombat, and basically track that from its infancy to where it comes into the story. And so because Oculus was, Oculus, their developer kits, the DK headsets that came out in 2013, they were not for me and you. They were for developers. Like their customer was developers, not us. And so I wanted to get more of the developer perspective. And so having, I think a good portion of, the second biggest storyline in the book is about Paul Bettner and Playful Corp, which created Lucky's Tale. And I think it's very telling that they make great games, but they're no longer making VR games because the industry did not support it, because Oculus failed in their promise to companies like that there was going to be this great gold rush. And so that was the extent that I was really willing to explore other companies, because I did feel like with some well-structured storytelling, I could still get in enough of other stuff, like the relationship with Valve and how that did sort of lead to the Vive, and also you see Sony's early interest. And then the one thing I didn't want to do was I didn't want to shoehorn in some of that story. I'm sure that there's a great book to be written about HTC's commitment to making the Vive, to making a VR headset, and I didn't want to just do a one-page version of that. That said, I did. And then I guess also because of the second half of the book, and because it became more like what you said, like a sort of like a sequel to Accidental Billionaires. To me, it was as much a look at Silicon Valley as it was at the gaming industry. Like in the updated edition, there's the one company I do look at is Google, which did Google Cardboard, and sort of the creation of that, which feels very much in line with how Silicon Valley operates. And yeah, so there was a lot of interviews that led to great background information, but their companies weren't written about, and that's sometimes tough. But the most important person to me is the reader. I want to make sure that they have an interesting story that will deliver all the information for them. And so I couldn't think of I really like The Void. I love their work. I love the guys there. I couldn't think of a good reason to The Void being part of the story didn't enhance it in any way, and ditto for other companies. The Void, I'm just using it as an example. But I really tried to just, I guess the more the VR news and what the hot new things were expanding, the more I wanted to narrow the scope of what I was actually focusing on, because I felt like that's at least where I knew there was a good drama, and from their perspective, I could see other things happening.
Awesome. Yeah, and I love the Void's product. We have a Void experience. We have the Star Wars experience here in Orlando. I live in Florida, so
I haven't tried that one.
Now they have so many other cool experiences, but they just shut down the Ghostbusters, which is so odd considering that new movie's coming out. But still, yeah, I when I was talking to you, it just seemed like that scope of that book was bigger. And let me be fair, I'm happy with the way that the book because I don't. Like you were saying, I think it gets harder to tell that story when you start throwing in these other VR companies that all have good products, but focusing on the Oculus and the HTC Vive definitely felt like the right way to go for the book. So I'm glad that there is another medium for me to find this. I mean, and I did have trouble finding this article for for this interview, but it's out there somewhere. It can be found, people. So go look it up.
Yeah. And then also of course, the way that the ending of the book became so much about politics and about Facebook, which was, Facebook I was planning to write about. Politics I had no interest in writing about. I don't really like politics. I don't really want to, it's definitely not my forte to write about. And that made it even harder to try to show what the Void was doing when you're dealing with someone, going through political discrimination and cover up at Facebook and all this stuff that became not about VR, but that felt pretty important because it showed you how Facebook operates and why they make some of the decisions they make that impact consumers.
All right. So that's it for my line of questioning. I'm going to let my partner take the wheel.
Yeah.
He's going to hit you with the hard ones. I softballed you.
Yeah. So you've already kind of touched on this here and there for the fact gathering processes for History of the Future, but how is the process of fact gathering different between that and Console Wars?
Really great question, because I feel like there was such a big difference. Obviously, we're talking about just the idea of something happening in the moment or over the past few years versus 25 years ago. Also, let's face it, like part of the problem that happened with Palmer was because of, in my opinion, bad journalism, or at least because of journalism and the way journalism operates. And so part of my approach differed. Part of my approach evolved because I didn't want to be what I thought the problem was. Like, I used to think that, like in Console Wars, it's recreated dialogue. So if Tom says, "Oh, I had a conversation with Al about, this movie or about how this product can be cool," I always, in most cases, I worked with the people. So like what resulted was pretty, seemed to reflect both. It felt like in the spirit. Basically, I felt like the goal there was to create a conversation that was in the spirit of what had happened. I no longer felt like the in the spirit was a good enough criteria for this book. I felt like every line of dialogue in there needed to be a verbatim quote from something that I had recorded, because I didn't want to have little inaccuracies, especially in this case when I could have it. I feel pretty confident there's no way that Tom and Al could remember what they talked about 25 years ago in specifics. Whereas now I felt like people could. There was also email records, or at least if they didn't remember the specifics, they remembered. They would probably give me a similar answer to what they had given the person. Like a good example is like Nate Mitchell asking Palmer, or maybe Brendan, like, what did your father do, Palmer? I feel like his answer to them was somewhat similar to what he said to me when I said, Palmer, what did your father do? And so I wanted to be much more meticulous. I also wanted to provide like more. I wanted to make sure that it was clear that, because of some of the controversial subject matter in the book, that like this was not my opinion, Blake Harris's author. Like, these were facts, and in a lot of cases, as much as possible, like, here's where it came from. It was from this email, this actual line. It wasn't like me editorializing. And I wanted to try to give readers the chance to like determine whether something was good or bad. The only place actually in the whole book where I feel like I stepped in as an author was like one part where about people at Facebook Facebook employees being upset about the election results and feeling like that was proof that they had messed up as an organization. And I made a comparison to like that would be like AT&T feeling like they had done their jobs poorly because, Reagan won the election, and feeling like that's not really what you should be doing. And even in that case, I kind of like, I debated cutting that, because I did feel like that was the only place where I went out of my way to make a point, whereas the rest of it I wanted to leave up to the reader. Yeah, so like my process was very different with this book. I transcribed every single interview. I used all the dialogue was actual quotes from people. It was in my mind it was like a documentary where, obviously I'm not if someone has a 45-minute interview, it's not pasting that all in, but I'm taking the lines from here and there and constructing it in a way that actually made sense for a narrative. But I was much more diligent, and I think that was a good thing. I think it forced me to raise my game, because I didn't want to be sort of the problems that I was seeing with a lot of journalism today.
Yeah, I have to agree. You did a really good job being unbiased, especially with how charged I feel like towards the end of that political section gets. And I do think that the comparison you make about AT&T and Facebook swaying voters is a good comparison, and it's still kind of, it's necessary, I guess, to say that, yeah, that's not quite what Facebook's job should be, to influence the public, but you don't really yell at Facebook about that. You just sort of put it out there, and I think that was good.
Yeah.
You open the book, though, at a pivotal moment in the history of Oculus when Mark Zuckerberg, he announces the purchase of Oculus to the employees, and there's this notion it's not quite sitting right, and Palmer seems very confident in the decision. But why did you start the book here?
No, that's a really good question. I think that I did want to establish early on that there would be like an accidental billionaire expense aspect to be known that Facebook would be a part of this. I also thought that Mark Zuckerberg became an important enough character that it was important to have him early. And then largely, I just wanted to get Mark's vision for VR in there and to show, because I think one of the big questions the book answers or aims to answer is like what did they do in 18 months that made them worth $3 billion? Or like, what could it, like, I've had other startups say, like, what can we learn from this? Obviously the value is like in the eye of the beholder. It still seems shocking to me that they were sold for that much money, but I wanted, like, part of it too was that it was appealing to Mark at the right time. Like, he felt like he missed out on the mobile wave, and you wanted to, he wanted to not miss out again. So it's not always just about timing is such a big part of it. And I thought that, one of the issues, like, I remember my first editor on the book, she would always tell me that it was going to be hard. She used an analogy like, it's like writing about VR is like dancing about architecture. Like, there's no, like you can't convey the experience. And early on, maybe, I could wax poetic, and I realized, like, there's no point. The best thing I can do is not to try to like use glossy language to describe Palmer's Rift prototype, but it's actually just to use the exact language of John Carmack talking about it. So John Carmack's someone you respect, and he says, this is what's good, this is what's bad. And so I kind of liked the idea of Mark Zuckerberg sort of being more of like a neutral observer to the story, saying, like, here's what I like about what this company has done, and at least giving us sort of like a non obsessive VR person's POV, because obviously Palmer thinks it's the best because he loves VR, but Mark, didn't have to get involved, and I wanted to at least show where his eyes were at.
Yeah, he's much more of like an investor in Oculus than an active participant in the technology behind it, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's very nice. In the beginning of the book, though, most people view VR as an unsustainable gimmick, always doomed to fail in the market. But do you think that with so many companies now with headsets, even like the cheaper ends, like you find at Walmart for $20, as we've already sort of touched, it's still slow, but do you think it'll stick? It hasn't dropped to the market yet. Think it'll stick?
I don't know. I mean, obviously no one knows, but like the sad thing is that I have such conflicted feelings about Facebook. I don't like how they treated me with the book. I don't like how they treated Palmer. I don't like that they created an environment that good people like Brendan and Nate and Mike ended up leaving. Like, but at the same time, I do like VR, and I do believe that if Facebook were to say tomorrow, you know what, we're giving up on VR, we tried, it didn't work, I believe that it would dry up. I believe that those headsets would no longer be in Walmart in a year from now, even though it's obviously not a Facebook headset you're talking about. But like, I just feel like Facebook is basically subsidizing the entire industry, in the sense that they are putting they spent $3 billion on Oculus. Mm-hmm. They spent billions on research and development. They spent billions on investing in content. And if they stopped doing that, I think the music would stop. And so as long as they still have that appetite, I think that the VR will stick around, because the truth is, like, it is not profitable. Even this many years later, it's not. Like, there's a reason that Paul Bettner and Playful aren't making VR games. Like, even from the content creator standpoint, it's not profitable, let alone from the hardware makers. There's definitely no reason to be in now. And I think that maybe it'll take a company like Apple, whether it's from an AR play or maybe a VR play, to really make a difference. But I'm still bullish on it, because I just think that, like, maybe I'm just like a romantic at heart, but when you put on a headset and have a good VR experience, it is incredible. It is beyond words. It is better than a telephone call. It is, you actually feel like you're in the room with someone else, or you can be made to feel that way. And my brother lives in Colorado. I would like for there to be a way for us to watch a movie together and to actually feel like I'm with him, as opposed to just both having it on the phone or something. So I still believe in it. And those reasons that I'm talking about are more the reasons that Facebook bought it. Obviously Oculus was by gamers for gamers, step into the game. Their whole thing was gaming, but Facebook's interest was the social aspect of it all. And so I still believe that in that side of the technology. What about you, actually, as someone who's like younger, who didn't live through previous VR failures? How do you feel about VR? Do you still believe in it, or think it's going to take off?
I very much do. I think it's still a slow build. I'm the proud owner of an Oculus as well as the PlayStation VR. I love Astrobot. I think that's such a fun game. I'm a big advocate for Ape Escape as well, just to be able to same people, and you can see the DNA in there. So gaming, I think it's a lot of fun. The Lucky's Tale originally is also sort of in the same vein as this VR 3D platformer, which is really cool. But then the experiences, I think, where it really shines. You've probably seen, VR chat and Recreation Room, all of the internet, and those are where the experiences are. People do VR yoga classes and movie nights, stand-up comedy, and that's wonderful. And I still think it is kind of niche. I think small community still, but it's a great experience.
It also kind of gets to why I wanted to open the book with basically the way that Mark saw VR and the way very much more like Brendan, co-founder Brendan Arib, saw it versus Palmer was like a trajectory similar to smartphones. Mm-hmm. The adoption rate of smartphones is like so unlike any other technology, certainly in my life, but I would imagine over like the past 100 years, like usually it is much more of a slow burn. Like one other thing that's going to be in the paperback is just like a small conversation between Brendan and Palmer, where Palmer sees it more. Originally on, he saw the potential for VR as more like the PC industry back in the 70s, where even when you had Apple being this great success story, it was still mostly homebrew enthusiasts that were buying this. Like my family didn't own a computer until like the mid 90s, which was 15 years after the success story. And so like that's probably much more like what it's going to be. But because we just lived through this crazy smartphone thing where we went from, no one having a smartphone to almost everybody on the planet having a smartphone in like 5 or 10 years, I thought it was important to show like that's what Mark was thinking to some degree. He obviously has not publicly admitted that he's been disappointed by Facebook sales, by Oculus sales, but like based on the internal emails, this was not what they projected. They did think it was going to be much more like 50 million to 100 million people 5 years after it came out having these headsets, which is obviously not the case.
I keep thinking that as a gamer, just pure hardcore gamer, I keep thinking as much as I think this is, VR is a great application for gaming, I keep thinking that we keep utilizing it in the wrong way. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers. When I think about VR, I keep thinking about what it could be as far as like an educational tool. One of the coolest things I've seen using VR was I saw an open heart surgery in VR, and they did it as a teaching tool. And I keep thinking, it's like, are we focused with VR in the wrong ways? Should we be so centrally focused on video games when it comes to VR that we're missing out like the obvious things, like the teaching mechanics of VR? And obviously Facebook's idea for VR, as kind of highlighted in the book and post book, they don't seem to fall in line with what VR can be, just what it should be right now. And that's
a really good point. Like, because just for people who haven't really tried VR or who sort of wonder why, like, okay, so in theory, VR is just like a game. It's a better version of a game. Like, how could it? Every game should be better in VR. But then just like a very easy example of why that's not the case is like, let's say you're playing John Madden football. The running back moves at a rate faster than you're used to, or in a first-person shooter, like if you're like basically a first-person shooter character is like a superhuman character. Like they run faster than a human, and like so when you're actually in it, it feels weird. It feels like sometimes even like nauseating to be moving at these rates that are not natural. So that does make it like, oh, it's not just like an enhancement of a typical game. And so some of the stuff that you're talking about, like the open heart surgeries or, going to visit just different destinations, like that does seem like better use cases because that's more like real life, or at least, real life, but with access to places that you normally wouldn't be able to have access to. And then it becomes a tough thing where I think Facebook has gravitated away from gaming more than most people would have expected and maybe wanted. But like, how do you get doctors? How do you get hospitals to like invest in this? Even if Facebook's willing to invest, like, what is the upside to the hospital? Why does, like, who cares if you're in open heart surgery? Obviously, it's cool, but like, there's not like a business. There's not a good business model sense for it, at least not yet. Especially when then you get to like the whole core chicken versus egg problem that the book tries to show. It's like, well, yeah, if 100 million people had headsets, then it would be worth the hospital investing ways to have relatives view it or younger doctors trained that way. But now only 1 million people have headsets. So even if everybody who had a headset bought it, you still would lose money. And so that's one of the more interesting things. And that's like that's one of the more interesting things about the Oculus proposition in general. Like, one of the most intelligent parts of the sell of Oculus was Brendan's idea to do it as like a developer kit, to not do it as a consumer product, to basically say we need years of people creating content to actually have this content to entice people to help solve this chicken versus egg problem. And thinking about it in that way was kind of fascinating, because like I love television. I always have it on when I'm working. But you think about like, what value is a television in the 1940s, 50s without television shows? And then what's the point of making television shows when no one has a TV set? And like, how did we actually get to the point where both things exist in a good way? And like, when you used to hear things like, oh, TV is going to fail, and you're thinking, oh, only an idiot would think that, you start to think, well, actually, that would kind of make sense. Like, how do we solve that chicken versus egg problem? And that's still where we're at. It's still a bit of a problem. That's why I said, like, you have Facebook basically subsidizing the industry, getting people to make content, paying them to make the content, even at a loss, just because they want that content to exist to entice more people.
But so touching on that maybe a bit more from Palmer's eyes, Palmer's journey is fascinating. It's all about this kid who is just tinkering away in the trailer, making breakthroughs with a technology that most people just think isn't relevant. And he turns into a valuable commodity that everyone really wants a finger in this pie. Other companies try to emulate, fast track it with Vive, PSVR. Do you think that these other products hurt the image of VR that Palmer strive for?
Great question. I'd say yes, but also like, I don't blame them. And also there's no, basically having a monopoly is the best way to make something work. Like, I think that when I started working on Console Wars, if the week that my book came out, 10 other books about Console Wars came out, there's probably a good chance that it would just make people be like, oh, I don't know which one to read, or like, oh, it's such a, like, everyone's talking about this now. Like, basically, I think that the Vive coming out at the same time as the Rift definitely hurt VR in general, but like, the Vive in many ways is better. And it's like, I tip my hat to HTC and to Valve for doing that. But I think that when Oculus was the entire industry, it definitely was better for VR. And like, I think that one of the biggest missteps that Oculus made was just taking so long. There's like that saying that, like, perfection is the enemy of good, or perfection is the enemy of great. And that was how it often felt to me. Like, even nowadays with the Quest, which is an incredible headset, incredible value, it's still like, oh, like someone could say, oh, it doesn't have this. Didn't have finger tracking. It doesn't have, X, Y, and Z features, but like, at some point you have to put out a consumer product and consider that your best foot forward for a period of time. And so I think that Oculus continually delaying it opened the door for other competitors, with, like I said, like, generally a better headset. Or one of my favorite parts of the book was like an email from a guy named Brant Lewis, where he's talking about the Vive basically doing what he thought he had signed up to do at Oculus, and like the Rift basically, by the time it came out in 2016, being like neither feast nor foul, where it was not the cheap VR headset. It wasn't the PS VR, which is like obviously still like $700 or whatever. But if you have a PlayStation, it was only a couple $100, few $100. So that was a cheaper option, or it was not the high end option like the Vive, which did room scale and it had motion controllers at first. And so the Oculus was like, they were no longer the company that was pushing the envelope, and they were no longer the company that was offering affordable VR. So what were they? And that was like, that would not have happened if there wasn't competition. But also, I think that it's fair to say that we wouldn't have the Quest if not for that competition. Like even if VR as a whole might be better theoretically. Like the products themselves have gotten better because competition. I'm sure it won't surprise you guys to know that I'm a big fan of competition. I wrote a book, Console Wars. I believe that pushing each other does lead to better products. But I think that's interesting because that's a great question. I did like a lot of mental exercise of just like, well, what would the world have seemed like if Valve never got involved with VR, if ATC didn't get involved, and I do think probably in the short run, better VR, quote unquote.
Actually talking a bit more about Valve, when Palmer Luckey and I believe Michael Antonov visit Valve to get the Kickstarter video done, Valve is sort of like hesitant about VR technology. They don't think it's gonna take off too well, but they do have a very small team working on AR projects over at Valve as well. And it seems implied that Valve thinks the AR technology has more applications and is superior to AR, and that AR displays are, superior. But what do you think about the future of AR technology?
I mean, at some point, like basically AR and VR become the same thing when the fidelity is there. It's basically just a matter of like, like how are you just going to make yourself insulated? It's basically just a matter of how much of the outside world are you going to block out. And I would agree, like with Michael Abrash at the time, like AR does have better applications. It makes more sense that if I'm going to go out and get a slice of pizza after this, that this technology moves with me, and that it gives me access to information that might be in the real world, or that I might just want to be accessing hands-free. There's also some creepy elements to that. I do like I like the idea of being home in a VR headset, but it makes sense. And I'm glad you touched on what Valve was actually up to at the time, because they deserve a lot of credit. Obviously, they if not for them, I don't think, or I know for a fact, DK2 wouldn't have been as good. The Rift headset wouldn't have been as good. But you see how even a company like Valve that has so much that makes a lot of money from Steam, and has the money to devote to resources, still is unwilling to commit to taking this leap. And that is ultimately kind of getting back to your earlier question that we talked about at the top of the show, of like why did I mostly focus on Oculus as opposed to other companies? And it's like Oculus was the one that was going to do this no matter what. And as a storyteller, as a romantic, that's what I like. I'm sure there were people who would have written Console Wars if someone had paid them to do so. But I think that what helped me write it was that I was going to do it, whether a publisher paid me a lot or whether it was me selling pamphlets on the street. Like, I was going to do it. And those are the kinds of stories I like, where someone is committed to doing it. Palmer was going to do this. Obviously, Brendan and Nate and Mike doing it with him made it so much bigger and so much more successful. But I think that it was amazing that he cared enough about this that he was going to do it. And those are the people that I often like writing about. Those are the people I think change history the most. And so it was significant to me that even some of the brightest minds at Valve, Michael Abrash and Ottman Binstock, they left Valve, which is a great company, to come to Oculus because Valve wasn't making enough of a commitment to this thing. And also understandable from Valve's perspective. Like, it was risky, and as we've talked about over the past half hour, like, it's not making money. Like, I don't know that Valve even made a bad decision, but as someone who loves VR, it's a decision that I don't like.
So going back to Zuckerberg, in that sort of moment when he buys the company, Zuckerberg states that he believes that VR is the future of computing, just like smartphones were to computers and so on and so forth. And it would replace smartphones. But the original intent of the Oculus device was for gamers, get into the game, etc. Do you think that the VR has more potential for gaming or computing or both?
I think both. Obviously, I think that Mark what he said will be right in the long run. I mean, I think an easy way to think about it is kind of just the idea of 3D versus 2D. Like, if you're looking at a photograph, it's a two-dimensional image, but VR or mixed reality or whatever the technology is like you can have things exist in 3D. You can have 3D television. You can have 3D everything, which I think is 3D television failed as a business, but like in general, I think that it's just when we have the computing, if we and when we have the computing power to do these things, it's going to make for more enriched experiences, like almost more like Harry Potter-esque experiences of like, the newspaper, it actually has like, characters moving or interactive things. My interest in VR was always beyond the gaming, but what I loved about the gaming, what I liked about Oculus was that they had the roadmap. Like basically, Mark Zuckerberg's long-term vision for VR is pretty similar to Brendan's, pretty similar to John Carmack's, pretty similar to Palmer's, who all have different visions. But it's like, in the end, perfect VR, we all sort of can imagine what that looks like. It's just a matter of how do you get there, and do we get there? And like gaming was a way gamers. That was an audience that was willing to spend a few extra $100 for a better experience, or to potentially have a better experience. And that could sustain businesses in theory to get us to the point where we can keep investing money in this and get us to that point. So that was what I liked about the gaming focus of Oculus, and why I think it's kind of sad that they abandoned that focus so early on. I think they've gotten back to it a bit more in recent years. But first, one of my favorite moments in the book that just felt kind of telling was like that character, the guy Chris Galizzi, who worked at Hyperkin doing peripherals, and how he had been working on a gun, which is a very common thing in a first-person shooter, which is one of the more common types of video games. And Facebook was not going to have a gun in their game they didn't want their brand to be associated with guns, which is they're right, and it's understanding. But that also showed that, like, all right, gamers are not a focus, because gamers would want a gun, and that was a pretty pivotal moment for me.
So we're coming up to my last two questions before we sort of turn it over back to a nice one here. So when Carmack is negotiating with Zuckerberg, John Carmack shares this vision of a future where VR is everywhere and big bulky headsets are reduced to normal, slim, lightweight glasses, sort of like what we have on here.
Yep.
And they switch from VR to AR on the fly. Do you think that future is still possible one day?
Yeah, I definitely do. And like, I feel like the way that helps convey that to people who don't, who maybe haven't tried VR or don't really know what it means, is like, I have a television over there that's, 40 inches, 50 inches, whatever it is, that probably at the time when I bought it cost like $1,500 or $1,000. But there will be a world, I believe, and there could be a world 5 or 10 years from now where you have glasses on and you spend $1 in the App Store for a 40-inch TV, and wherever my head turns, the TV, the quote-unquote screen still stays there, and it'll present. Like, I guess one really eye-opening experience for me was like a virtual cinema. It's talked about in the book very briefly, but like, my TV is only 40 inches, but I could put on a headset and actually feel like I'm in a movie theater and have a screen that feels to me like it's 100 feet wide. So that idea that you can have a 100-foot thing just because of how the dimensions work and what your perception is, like that, I think that it's very reasonable that it can replace a lot of screens. Where it will be kind of weird is like, I watch most of my television with my wife. So since we're not actually looking at a real television and it's just an app in our glasses or contact lenses or whatever, there's obviously ways to accommodate that. If you can sync it up, but it's kind of weird. It's kind of but I do believe, like, John of course is a genius. He's also not always right, but I think that he's more right than wrong. And in the long run, I think that he's going to be right with that.
That's fair. Then my last question before I turn it back over to Nice One. Probably one of the more intense questions I'm going to throw at you. So Palmer Luckey is the main character sort of in the book. It follows his journey pioneering the modern VR technology as we know it today. It's mostly his story, but then near the end of the book, Palmer is ousted from the company for his political beliefs and is the target of big lawsuits from companies like ZeniMax. But since for the most of the book we follow Palmer's perspective on his journey, it kind of creates the image of Palmer being portrayed as a victim, despite the book trying to be an unbiased history of the future. So do you believe Palmer Luckey is a victim? What are your thoughts on that? Perspective, I guess.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely believe he's a victim, but he's also someone who's been incredibly fortunate in his life financially and with how he gets to spend his time. So like, I believe that he was treated unfairly. I don't believe that anyone should lose sleep feeling bad for him. I think that to me, what I liked, some of my favorite responses to people reading the book was they're like, oh, I just read 500 pages and I don't know whether Palmer's a good guy or a bad guy. I don't know whether I should feel bad for him. And it's like these are the tough questions in life. Should you feel bad for someone who, in my opinion, was mistreated and was a victim of poor reporting and, sort of intolerance, political intolerance, but also at the same time is a young guy who's made hundreds of millions of dollars and is going to go on to do other things and is going to be set for the rest of his life? I don't know. I mean, I don't think you should need to go protest and be all upset about it. But what I really liked about his story was that I felt like he was just the perfect avatar for so much of what is happening in culture today. So don't feel bad for Palmer. He's going to be fine. He's a super rich guy, but maybe you see someone online that is not well off, that is being, bullied online or, being misreported and they lose their job. I would maybe feel bad for that person. And I'd also be more the hope is that you would try to be more, not even sympathetic, but more interested in trying to understand what actually happened. I think what you learn, whether you like Palmer or not, whether you think he was treated unfairly, I think it's pretty objective to say that what was reported was not accurate. And so to basically try to look beyond the headlines. And that's kind of unfair because the whole point of journalism is you guys shouldn't have to do your own due diligence. You should be able to just trust what someone who's being paid to do this is telling you. But I think that we are beyond the point where we know that what we read is not often the truth, that there are agendas involved, and that it's just so much easier to to make characters out of people, to say Palmer Luckey is alt-right or a white supremacist or a Nazi, and those are such charged words that it's hard. Once you say them, it's hard to ever put it back, even if there's proof otherwise. You feel it's just hard to dissociate those things. And so it was nice to write about Palmer in that regard, because I don't think that that he requires your sympathy, but it does sort of make you think more about other people who have had things like that happen to them that maybe do deserve your sympathy, or figuring out how you can, for me personally, I've never been a huge online social media guy, but I'm sure that I retweeted pile on sorts of things, or I was quick to judge someone, and it certainly made me think twice about that. And I think that we'll all be better off if we didn't have such quick triggers. In the end, nobody cared what actually happened, not even the journalists. When I contacted them to say, here's what my research after dealing with all these people firsthand revealed, they didn't care, because there had already been a story out there. And I think that what I started to see was not that this didn't just happen with Palmer, that this happens a lot with a lot of different people. So I guess for me, it taught me to be more tolerant in that regard. And also we don't really need to get too much into it, but the political thing is largely because Palmer is a Trump supporter, and that was very unpopular in Silicon Valley and amongst many people in the tech and gaming press. And I'm personally very much not a Trump supporter. I'm a Trump hater, you could say. And so it was very hard for me to try to write that fairly, and to make sure that I was, not trying to make you feel like Palmer's a victim, but at the same time, not try to be unfair to him just because he has a different political view than I do. And so I felt overall, my process of writing it and researching it made me more tolerant and open-minded. And I hope that when people read it, they would have a similar outcome. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Very good way to put it.
Awesome. Dude, we have so many more questions that are just in line with
all right, well,
the political aspect, but we're not going to mess.
You can have me back on. Have me on. You can have me on for a third time. That comes out.
I'm going to put these on ice, and I definitely want to have you back on at a later time. But we have two more questions, and then we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up. These should be easy. What's next for Blake J. Harris? The last 6 years have been extraordinary. Console Wars, the larger, project, and the history of the future. And now with getting an expanded edition, what's next or are you just laser focused on the tasks at hand?
No, I'm always thinking about other stories. Hopefully I'll have some news. But I'm meeting with my publisher next week to talk about what I want to write about next. So I'll wait till after that happens to see if they're on board with it too. But you should, hopefully in the next month or two, I'll be able to answer that question and tell you what I research next.
Sweet. All right. So last question, real easy, nice and softball. Sonic the Hedgehog live action movie comes out on Valentine's Day. What are your thoughts on the film, the controversy, and are you going to go watch?
I'm super excited about it. I'm a huge Ben, definitely, is right in my wheelhouse. I think you're talking about like the animation CGI thing, controversy. I think that's awesome. I think that look, if I put out a book or a sample chapter and a lot of people had strong feedback to it, that's really helpful to me. I don't have to change my work to accommodate them, but if they say stuff that I think is helpful, just like between writing Console Wars and the second book, I learned things. There was criticism that I thought was valid and it made me do a better job. So I think that it's really awesome that enough people seemed upset and concerned about Sonic, who is a character I obviously love, that they did a better job. And it seems like the new Sonic is definitely a Sonic that's more adorable and cool and more like the Sonic that I remember. And yeah, I'm really excited. I don't know if my wife will let me take her on opening night because it's like Valentine's Day, but I definitely want to see it opening weekend. What about you guys? Are you guys optimistic?
See, as a huge Sonic fan, I'm gonna be on the other side of the spectrum. I'm gonna stay far away from this movie. I feel we're entering a Super Mario Brothers territory again, and I'm one of those guys that's like, there has not really been a great adaptation of a video game into film, and I'm gonna stay away. If it comes to Netflix, Redbox, or any of the other streaming services the million that I have subscribed to, then I'll give it a watch. But yeah, sorry Sega, I'm gonna sit this one out.
Right. I mean, I think Sega has not earned your trust. I mean, I'm very excited about it, and largely it's because of the Ben Schwartz thing, but Sega has not done a great job with Sonic over the past 10, 15 years. I don't think that they should, I think it's right for you to be suspicious. And hopefully I'll be back. When I'm back next time, I'll tell you what an awesome movie it was, and you'll see it on Netflix, or maybe if it's still playing, you'll see it.
All right. Well, Blake, we want to thank you so much for appearing on the show. It's been incredible.
I do plan on watching Sonic. Very much so. I don't think that the plot will be that good. I don't think I'm there for the plot. I think I'm there for a good romp, because there's nothing better on Valentine's Day in the theaters.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not single. I don't think I'd get away with that, even if I wanted to go.
Watching for the experience to say that I did it,
All right. Well, Blake, we want to thank you so much for appearing on the show. It's been incredible for us to, delve deeper into your works. I'm personally really excited to go ahead and reread The History of the Future once the expanded edition is released. I'm also really looking forward to the Console Wars documentary and everything else that you're going to be doing in the future. Do you want to tell your audience where they can find any more of your content?
Sure. I have a website that's just my name, Blake J. Harris, all one word.com. I try to put up a lot of excerpts and articles. I want people to know what they're getting before they buy something, or and like you mentioned earlier, a few articles about The Void. There was something about Lucky's Tale and Playful in there. There was an upload that's on the website, and I'm on Twitter at Blake J. Harris NYC. I'm usually pretty responsive. Now is admittedly a tough time with us finishing the doc, but as you guys know, also let listeners know that I had to cancel on the show twice, and you guys couldn't have been more gracious. So thank you for your flexibility. Not every host is always so good about that. So it's been a busy time for me, and I really appreciate you guys being flexible, and your audience should know that you guys are behind the scenes. You're good guys to work with.
Thank you.
We try our best. We love doing these interviews, especially this one. This one means a lot to me. It's been 4 years since I interviewed you last, my first interview, and you got so much cool shit coming out that I was like, how could I not revisit any of this?
All right, awesome. So, I look forward to visiting again after you see the doc, and you can fire as many hardballs as you guys want at me. Thanks for having me on.
Critical after the doc.
All right.
No, but I totally look forward to it. Blues, any closing thoughts before we let Mr. Harris go?
It was really cool seeing your take on this. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much for being on the show.
All right. Well, we don't want to take up too much of your time. We promised you an hour and a half, and we're right at that last minute mark. So, guys, he told you where you can hit him up at. You know where to hit us up at, youtube.com/Nintendo Power Zone. You can find us on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, and all that good shit. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed this interview because I'm not gonna lie, I think I creamed myself like 3 or 4 times throughout the course of this one, and that gets COPA off of our backs for this. We've now hit our official COPA, protection for this podcast. Blake, thank you so much. We would love to have you back on after the doc comes out. And yeah, that's gonna wrap this show up. You guys, thank you so much for watching, and remember to stay fresh.